Before the 2012 season started, I thought the Carolina Panthers were going to be a real surprise team. I saw a lot that I liked in 2011. I thought they were going to come out this year, surprise some people, be one of those chic, fashionable picks to make the playoffs. I thought they were going to win 10 games, be a wild card team. Obviously, that didn't happen. So even though there were some frustrating negatives for the Panthers players, coaches, fans, the organization in 2012, I also do think there are some potential positives. Now, they started off the year 2-8, and it was almost like Carolina just couldn't win games. They were trying to find ways to lose games. They were coming up with creative ways to lose games. But then they rebounded nicely, and they finished 5-1 over the last 6 weeks of the season. So they had some great momentum going at the end of the year, which tends to usually bode well for the next season. They lost 7 games by 7 points or less. And what that means to me is that sometimes you have teams in certain sports, they figure out how to win games on the fly. They figure it out as they go how to be winners. And other times you have teams that it takes a little bit more time. They have to struggle and lose first and then learn from those mistakes to figure out how to become winners. And if anything, that's maybe what this 2012 season was ultimately all about with the Carolina Panthers, was learning from those early season struggles and mistakes and inconsistencies and figuring out how to overcome those late in the year and starting to win football games. It ended up probably saving Ron Rivera's job, no question about it, because the Panthers ended up finishing 7-9 and second in the NFC South. Not a horrible season, but a little bit disappointing. They've got the 14th overall pick in this upcoming April's NFL draft. Offensively, Cam Newton had a good year, even though he was very maddeningly inconsistent and at times very frustrating to watch the first 10 games or so in 2012. He still threw for 3,800 yards. In particular, I thought he played a lot better at the tail end of the season. He also led the team in rushing. That's not good. 2 former first-round picks in D'Angelo Williams and Jonathan Stewart, both running backs, and your quarterback is leading the team in rushing. Maybe sometimes I think that's the problem with Carolina, is they expect Cam Newton to be too much of that all-around Superman like he was for Gene Chizik and Auburn in that 2010 National Championship season. You got another 1,000-yard receiving season out of Steve Smith, Yeah, I'm starting to think that this guy someday will have a bust in Canton. Might not get there right away, but I think someday you might have to consider it. A very underrated player and a really, really good wide receiver for a number of years in the NFL. And perhaps you would easily argue the greatest player in the history of the Panthers organization, all 17, 18 seasons that they've had, mind you. Greg Olsen has come in and become another weapon for Cam Newton to throw to in the passing game. It's nice when you have that tight end. A tight end a lot of times is viewed as a quarterback's best friend, a safety valve, and not only that, but an explosive weapon out of that position, something that a lot of teams don't have, like the Chicago Bears. You're welcome, Carolina. Defensively, though, this was a team that statistically wasn't that terrible. They've got a pair of great young ends in Greg Hardy, a former 6th-round pick, and Charles Johnson, a former 3rd-round pick. These guys are damn good, and they can get after the quarterback. Defensive tackle, not so much. Not terrible, but definitely not of the caliber of Greg Hardy and Charles Johnson on the outside. Their 9th overall selection from the 2012 draft, Luke Kuechly, came in and had a Defensive Rookie of the Year caliber season. He was phenomenal. He was everything you would want out of a rookie linebacker that you take in the top 10 and then some. So, and you throw in there a Chris Gamble at corner. There are pieces on that defense, too, that suggest that this defense isn't that far away from being a really damn good, really damn scary defensive unit for head coach Chico Rivera. And one of the great things for the Carolina Panthers heading into this offseason is they really don't have any free agents of any significance or any note. And that's important, too, because based off of what they did in 2012, the struggles early and the rebounding late and figuring some things out, if you're able to maintain a large portion of your roster intact and have some continuity in your organization, that tends to bode very, very well for the next season. Now, as far as the Panthers, you wonder maybe how they've gotten to this position, why they only won 7 games this past season, besides some of the reasons I've talked about, why maybe the future looks bright. It really comes down to their draft history over the past 5 years. Over the past decade plus or so, under their old GM, one thing the Panthers seemed to do a lot of times was hit on their first-round picks. And you would say, well, Schleg Daddy, you've talked about in other videos the importance of first-round picks, and if you hit on so many first-round picks, you should be successful year in and year out. Well, but when you look at the Carolina Panthers draft history, one thing that they failed to do, obviously, until 2011 was effectively draft a long-term answer at quarterback for when Jake Delhomme's time was going to be up. And when you take Jimmy Clausen in the second round in 2010, and he ends up being as bad as he was in the action that he got, and you really ignored the position by and large the rest of the time, it's not a surprise to me when that 2010 season happened that the Carolina Panthers were as bad as they were. They've also been a team that has made some notoriously bad picks in the second or third round. Whether you're talking about trading a future first rounder to get into the second round and take Everett Brown. No, you don't fucking do that. Period. Taking other guys in the middle rounds. Whether, like I said, second or third round, whether you're talking about guys like Dwayne Jarrett or Monty Edwards. Imagine if they had taken guys with those picks that were offensive weapons that worked out, how much better that Carolina Panthers offense would be. They've hit on a lot of the first round picks, yes, but in those other critical, key, important rounds, the second, the third, the fourth round, by and large, a lot of times they've missed. They've had success in the past finding a guy like Charles Johnson in the third round, obviously, Greg Hardy in the sixth round, obviously, so there's some success there too, but there are some failures there. Now, I think Kuechly is obviously a cornerstone of that defense for years to come. But the most important pick of all has been Cam Newton. Once you get that quarterback, it makes up for potentially a lot of other mistakes. And if you get some other things right, boy, you are that much better off. Perhaps the single biggest mistake, though, for the Carolina Panthers, I think, points back to that 2008 draft. That's where they took Jonathan Stewart, number 13, and they traded their first-round pick in 2009 to take Jeff Otah, number 17. The reason the Jonathan Stewart pick was a mistake is because you had already 2 years before that invested the first-round pick in DeAngelo Williams. And no matter how talented you thought both running backs were, they were both playing the same position. You invested 2 high draft picks in a 3-year stretch on the same position, a lot of money into the same position, where most of the time, only one of those guys is going to see the field at a time. That's not good. It's ultimately, even if Jonathan Stewart, he's had problems staying healthy, and he's gotten limited action, then he gets some action, and then he doesn't get action, or same thing with DeAngelo Williams, he struggled to stay healthy. The bottom line is, this is maybe one of those examples where you have 2 really talented running backs, but you really don't have one running back. And I think a lot of the mistakes you could point back to with this Panthers organization over the past few years can really go back again to when they made the decision to take Jonathan Stewart and then traded up back into the first round at pick 17, gave up a future first rounder to take Jeff Otah. Otah couldn't stay healthy to save his effing life, and Jonathan Stewart and DeAngelo Williams kind of sort of cancel each other out. You've got all this money invested into this position, and you really can only play one guy at a time. That was a valuable first-round pick in 2008 that they could have used in other areas on that football team. And that was a big mistake. Now they can counterbalance that mistake, obviously, because they have Cam Newton. And when you have Cam Newton, that makes up for a lot of things. And now you bring in a new offensive coordinator in Mike Shula, and in particular, an acquisition that I really like for that coaching staff is Ken Dorsey being named quarterbacks coach. During his time in Miami, one thing you could say about Ken Dorsey, he was a very cerebral quarterback. He had I would almost say, an encyclopedic knowledge of opposing defenses and of his own offense. He had a really good grasp on things. He wasn't a guy necessarily that was athletic or had the strongest arm. But there's a reason he won at Miami, and it wasn't just because of the phenomenal teams that Butch Davis and Larry Coker had assembled that. It was because Ken Dorsey knew what the hell he was doing and really has a good understanding and grasp of the game of football. And I think you're going to see, in fact, you can book it. The Schleg Daddy says it shall be done. In 2013, Cam Newton will have a better year than even they had in his rookie year. He may run a little less, but I guarantee you he'll get back up over 4,000 yards, and his touchdown to interception ratio will improve, and he'll make better decisions in key moments, in part because of working with Mike Shula and Ken Dorsey. They will be very beneficial to him on that side of the ball in 2013, no question about it. Now, the question is, what are the Carolina Panthers going to do in this offseason in the upcoming NFL draft? In this upcoming offseason, I don't know how active the Panthers are necessarily going to be in the free agent market. Maybe they'll give a sniff to Greg Jennings. I do think that the number 2 wide receiver position still needs to be addressed. I'm not a huge Brandon LaFell fan, but more importantly, Steve Smith's not going to play forever. At some point in time, you're going to have to find somebody that could at least be close to being his equal and find yourself a long-term answer as a number 1 wide receiver down the road. Again, I don't think they're going to be incredibly active in free agency. They could find one guy here, one guy there, maybe add somebody in the secondary, maybe try to address one of the defensive tackle positions. But I think a lot of this year's offseason is going to be centered around the NFL draft for the Carolina Panthers. When this Panthers team is laid out to me on paper looking at 2013, I don't necessarily see a team with a ton of holes. Now, offensively, like I mentioned, I think that wide receiver is still a need. And I also think the interior of that offensive line is a bit of a need. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a first-round need in the draft, but I think at some point it does probably need to be addressed. Defensively, the biggest need area, I suppose, that would stand out, their linebacking core is very solid. They've got great defensive ends. They've got one corner in Chris Gamble that's really damn good. They could use some help in that secondary, but in particular on the interior of that defensive line. One way to make Greg Hardy and Charles Johnson that much better is to give them some line mates on the interior that eat up some blockers and cause some havoc themselves. And when you look at where the Panthers could go possibly, assuming if they were to stay put at number 14, they could look at guys like Jonathan Hankins and Sheldon Richardson and Chelsea Williams, all defensive tackles that would definitely have an impact on the interior of their line. If a Chance Warmack fell to them somehow, some way at number 14, they could be looking at making a vast improvement on the interior of that offensive line. Because ultimately, even with defensive needs, and there are some, remember first and foremost that this team is being built around Cam Newton. And as a result, that's where the most focus should be placed, in my opinion, when shit gets to get. You could also be looking at potentially receivers like Cordero Patterson if he's there, or Keenan Allen, or whatever. I think the Panthers could be in a very beneficial spot. They could sit there at 14 and just take the best player available at a position of need. It's a perfect marriage of things. Or I think the Panthers could potentially get very creative. I know this. I brought this up to my friend and Bleacher Report NFL person, Anthony Rizzuti, and he loved this. I think he may have masturbated when I proposed this idea to him. The Panthers don't have a third-round pick this year, and they don't necessarily have a ton of glaring needs, at least in my humble opinion. I think what you could see the Panthers do, or maybe if I was running the show, what I would potentially be trying to do, is I would hope that one of those 3-4 outside edge rushers that are going to be in this draft gets to me at 14. And hoping one of these teams in the early to mid-20s, whether it be in Indianapolis or somebody else, decides, we've just got to have this guy. And somebody trades up with them to 14, and Carolina drops down into the 20s, and in the process maybe picks up a third or fourth round pick along the way, again to compensate for that third round pick they don't have. Then they would be somewhere in the 20s where a team in the early second round may say, you know what, we got to get one of these quarterbacks, whether it be Barkley or Nassib or E.J. Manuel or whoever. Tyler Wilson, we've just got to have him. Then the Panthers could potentially dump out of the first round entirely, pick up an extra second round pick, pick up a third round pick, and you're looking at a team that would have, 2 seconds, a third, 2 fourths, or if they wanted to get really creative and really roll the dice to me with the Panthers, you could sit there and say, well, we have a second and a couple of fourths. How about if somebody's trying to trade up with us towards the end of the first round, we ask for a first-round pick next year. Get that first-round pick next year, you have 2 first-round picks, and then to me, you could potentially be looking at, let's say, one pick would be in the 8 to 12 range, and the Panthers pick would be somewhere in the low to mid-20s. Now you can package those two up, make a big move up the draft board in 2014 and draft Marquise Lee, the wide receiver out of USC. That's another way to approach this draft. Maybe Panther fans like that idea. Maybe they don't. But I think that regardless, the Panthers are in an incredibly good position in this draft. They could sit there and take best player available, add a position of need, or they could sit there and get creative, try to accumulate extra picks, and really play the draft game and really set themselves up for long-term success.